Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
Well, David, what are we talking about today?
Let's talk about justice.
Justice, eh? Okay.
I'm not doing it.
I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it.
I'm not doing it.
I'm not saying your word.
For everyone who doesn't understand what that is from,
Freedom Tunes. You should check it out.
Yes. Freedom Tunes, Jordan Peterson.
I'll make sure to link that below. Anyway, well, as always, let's start talking about what we're talking about. The Oxford defines justice in two primary ways. The first way is the mass noun for justice. For justice is just behavior or treatment. The example given is a concern for justice, peace, and genuine respect for the people. The sub-definition that go along with that is the quality of being fair and reasonable. And the second sub-definition is the administration of the law or authority in maintaining this. The second definition of justice from the Oxford is a judge or magistrate, in particular a judge of the Supreme Court or country or state. So that's the individual noun, not the mass nouns.
Right, that's like a title that a person could hold.
Right, we're mainly talking about justice, the concept, not justice, the person. So, just to be fair, David and I have spoken quite a bit about justice before in our own time. And we each have pretty different opinions on justice.
In fact, it's probably what we spent most of our time talking about before deciding to make this show.
Right, and it's only weird that we now get to the topic. Granted, there's a lot of groundwork that needed to be laid to get to this point. So, to start off and to finish the, preface to this, the conversation we've talked about has often revolved around an ideal justice system. And it was in that conversation, and I think you'll find in most conversations that are like this, you'll start talking about something that's ideal. We certainly did. And then once you start trying to figure out why you disagree, you start breaking things down into its components and into the principles that would support your ideal. So that's what happened with us. We started talking about an ideal criminal justice system. Once we realized we disagreed, we highlighted the areas we disagreed and the areas we agreed, separated them. And then we tried to find the common principles between us that just our outcome on this principle is really what caused us a chain effect for us to disagree on idealistic principles. So, as not to rehash that entire discussion, the multitude of hours that have now probably been accumulated into that discussion, we're going to do this a little more formally. So, the first thing I want to call in as evidence, since we're doing justice today, no, I'm just kidding, I don't want to keep that format, that would be really difficult, is a video we mentioned not last week, but the week before, for Anti-Citizen X, where he just talks about free will. There is a small section, because of the example he used of a trial, where he talks about the 5 doctrines of justice that we commonly see played out in human societies. These were restitution, deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and retribution. Now, for those of you who watched that video, you'll likely know exactly where David and I are going with this. However, we're not going to make you pause and then go watch a different video. Instead, we're going to just kind of work through them here. So, let's start with the first one, if that's all right with you.
Sure. So, restitution. So, I think an easy definition for that would be basically giving back what was taken, or righting the wrong, so to speak.
Yeah, settling the account, if you will.
Right.
Okay. I have nothing wrong with that. And I think that's often what people mean when they talk about something being fair, or when they use justice and fairness interchangeably, is they mean restitution. Like, well, if we both did the same work, we should both be paid the same. In a way that is saying, that's what restitution is kind of getting at. So that's I think most people are very familiar with that, even if they don't know the word restitution and don't use it regularly. That's really what they're talking about.
Right, or, I steal $10 from you, so I owe it to you back.
Right. Yeah. The second doctrine is deterrence. Now, this is something that we see oftentimes when people are discussing the punishments for crimes. Oftentimes, and when people talk about criminal justice reform, they will often debate the concept of justice under the deterrence doctrine, and that is if the punishment for a crime is not high enough, or if a reasonable individual decides that that punishment's not so bad and worth the risk of me attempting to do something that would be considered a crime, I would attempt the crime anyway. However, if the punishment sorely outweighs even the benefit of committing a certain crime, I would not do that. That's deterrence. Like, for instance, if the punishment for stealing anything in value over $10 was death, people probably would be less inclined or deterred from theft. And you'll often hear people quote certain countries that have laws like this on the books as an example of, well, look at the theft in that place where the crime is so high, the punishment is so high, that they're talking about using deterrence as a method by which to keep people in line.
Right, or the classic example, especially in modern society, of deterrence here is speeding. We have a behavior that we would like to control, which is driving much too quickly on the roads and putting others in danger. And so we impose a fine on those caught doing it to deter them from doing it. And of course, the amount of the fine will determine just how much people are willing to push the boundary. But of course, if we were to take an extreme measure and say, if we catch you speeding, we'll kill you, then that's pretty extreme, and you can bet that people will be less likely to speed. Of course, the problem is that we have an intuitive sense of what is a measured response to something, and going a little bit too fast on the highway isn't really seen as worthy of such a harsh punishment.
Right, and that concept of measured response comes all the way back to basic human interactions. If you are insulted by someone else, you know that you feel as though you could insult them back in a certain measure that's appropriate. And for some people, and this is where it gets difficult because what's considered acceptable ramifications differs from person to person. For instance, here where David and I are from, there's this concept called fighting words, where what's considered acceptable for uttering certain words or certain connotations at a person is a physical response, and that's considered measured. But I think that's only in certain social circles, and so that's like the counterweight to deterrence.
I think and also you can see examples of this in culture very easily, where especially if you look at British or Australian culture, they will casually toss around words which are considered extremely offensive in the United States.
Right. I'm not going to mutter any of them. I almost gave examples, but
if you're on the internet, you know.
Yes. If you found this video, you probably are aware. The next concept or doctrine under the purview of modern justice is rehabilitation. And this one, I think, gets the most traction, at least of late. And while we don't try to comment too much on modern current events and things like that, rehabilitation is often offered as it's strange. Rehabilitation is often championed as the ideal way, as a replacement for justice, but in reality, it's a subset. And the purpose of rehabilitation is simply to put forth measures that will prevent an individual from doing something you don't want them to do. And in the case of criminal justice, it's how can I make this person or incentivize this person to not break the law again with a high degree of accuracy. Like, that's the whole point.
Right. You know, how can we get someone who has a tendency of violent behavior to not be as violent without having to resort to putting them in a cage for the rest of their life?
Right. And this is often used, I feel like sometimes rehabilitation and incapacitation, which is the next one, get used not interchangeably, but rehabilitation can take advantage of the incapacitation doctrine, but it's not the point.
Right. So rehabilitation really is the ideal case in which someone has done something bad, which is not ideal, but basically through the process of whatever measures we happen to implement, we get them to not do it again. They change their attitude toward it. And so then they become essentially a normal functioning member of society, just like everyone else who hadn't done that.
Right. I think it's important also to note that rehabilitation does not always mean something positive, because I think the connotation for rehabilitation is generally, well, we will get you help. And that help is typically imagined in the form of, counseling, therapy of some sort, whereas that's not always the case. Sometimes rehabilitory measures cannot appear so great for the individual being rehabilitated.
We do this with children with the concept of timeout.
Right.
Go to the corner and think about what you've done.
Sort of, but I would argue that timeout is also a type of incapacitation as well.
Well, they as far as the way we implement them in a justice system, they go hand in hand. Normally, our offender is incapacitated simultaneously as they are rehabilitated.
Right. But the point I'm trying to get across is rehabilitation can be applied outside of just human beings. It isn't in this case, but for example, in domesticated animals, which some would say is how those who are incarcerated are treated, to each to their own to judge that. I don't know enough statistics on it. But in the instance of a domesticated animal, rehabilitation could mean causing that animal pain in order to form a negative association with a certain behavior. For instance, I can't confirm that this is being done, and I don't think that it is, but there have been studies done before, especially in the area of those who have drug addictions, where they will scientific studies have been done where they expose those individuals who are addicted to certain drugs to minute doses of the drug and then put them through some sort of psychological trauma. Maybe not major enough to scar them. I mean, again, how would you know? But form an association between, this is a bad thing, it causes me pain, to help overcome the already formed association or reassign the association of this is something that makes me feel good. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
To keep rehabilitation in a fair light for our discussion, I just want to keep in mind the whole point of rehabilitation is to essentially train or through means of some type of therapy, and I'm using that in the clinical sense because therapy could literally mean anything. It's just a repetitive path to move towards a goal. Encourage certain behaviors or deter other behaviors, or because it could be both. The next doctrine under justice is incapacitation. The doctrine of incapacitation is as it sounds. You incapacitate the person who is doing something wrong. This is typically cited more for victim crimes as opposed to the victimless crimes, whether you agree that those exist or not. But any crime that usually deals with offensing against another individual, the first thing that people will try to do is you incapacitate them. And usually incapacitation means incarceration. You remove them from society and put them in a controlled state. And then from there, you can administer another doctrine. However, the full doctrine of incapacitation is just simply removal. If a person, and there are crimes that we consider incapacitation as the only doctrine really to use. And like, for instance, in the crimes that are victim like murder, not to move ahead in the conversation, but it's kind of hard to do some type of restitution for murder, because what is the quantitative value of a life? And so that's a murky question. When deterrence is, well, he's already killed somebody, or he or she has already killed somebody. We already probably have the strictest penalties for the strictest crimes, so that probably didn't work. And then rehabilitation is, well, can you rehabilitate this person, or even if you could, what is your level of confidence going into that person being out again and being amongst society? And oftentimes incapacitation is the easy answer. Well, none of that matters if he or she interacts with society again. You just set them aside and be done with it.
A lot of that has to do with the details of the particular case.
True.
With the case of a murderer, why did they murder that person? Is it because they had an episode and just became violent and ended up killing people, or was it because that person had a personal vendetta against somebody and sought them out to kill them?
Right. And not to get too much into specifics, but the doctrine of incapacitation can be applied in the temporary sense and in the permanent sense, I guess. The doctrine of incapacitation is currently applied in the temporary sense all the time. For instance, when you are detained or you are arrested to await a trial, it's often used as the quickest measure because it's the one that's typically the most secure. If someone commits a crime or violates the law, the quickest way to make sure they don't do that again is to put them in a controlled environment. And then the doctrine of incapacitation says that keeping people separate from society is what's best for society, or at least for any given amount of time. And so that's how we should remediate them, those who committed crimes. The last doctrine is retribution, and this one's interesting because it stands out from the others on the list. What really bonds the first four types of doctrines under together is they all are trying to achieve the same goal. They're trying to achieve or move society in a direction that is better than it is now.
We, as quote-unquote society, have decided we don't want these behaviors to happen. And so these four ways can be implemented in order to lessen the frequency at which they happen.
Exactly. However, with retribution, this is a more personal doctrine. And the doctrine of restitution says that punishment needs to be carried out simply because someone did something wrong. And I may be misquoting this, but to the enjoyment of those to see justice done.
Retribution, by the way, not restitution.
Did I say restitution?
You did.
Oh, retribution.
Right. So punishment for punishment's sake, really.
Yes. And you see this all the time. Well, you see this a lot more frequently in the past, where someone who I'm trying to think of a good instance. The French Revolution, for example. A lot of the people who were killed during the French Revolution were killed out of retribution. Or punished for just punishment's sake. It's a human desire to witness harm in some way being brought against someone that you don't like, And it's weird, but I think everybody knows what that feels like. I don't think that there's anybody who's listening to this who's ever, you see the snot-nosed kid in front of you that's always bullying you in class, even if it's just verbally, like they're just kind of a jackass, And when you see them get in trouble, you don't feel good about it because, you might rationally think that's a good thing, that's correct, but you emotionally feel good about it. You smile when you see that happen. You enjoy knowing that they're in trouble. Not really because it's even just or because it's correct, but because that's how you feel. You're like, finally. And when you hear people say the often quoted line, finally they're getting what they deserve, that's not really talking about restitution. It's the emotional response that humans get from watching someone get what they deserve. You know, it's hard to talk about this in the concept of a legal doctrine, but because it's oftentimes used in a much more personal way. However, on the societal level, you can look at good examples from wartime societies. For example, the United States during World War II had vilified their enemies. And it's no different than any other country. Propaganda existed like to cause this, because it's a lot easier to keep a country going in wartime when you think that the enemy you're fighting is literally the devil. You know, but winning, you know, battles and stuff like that aren't just a feel-good moment, and they're not portrayed as feel-good moments just because we won out of, you know, victory. It's that extra little bit that it's like, yeah, you know, they deserved it, you know. And the most shocking example of this is a lot of people's opinions in 1945 when the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan. It's amazing the sentiment that was held so widespread over that decision, even though a lot of the facts about what happened, you know, some people like to say, well, no, they just didn't understand how truly devastating it was. No, I actually do think that a lot of people fully understood it. You know, we weren't hiding anything. It was a display. And the American people, for example, loved it. You know, they thought it was right, and they felt good about causing the death of that many people. You know, it's that, and that's an example I can give on a collective scale. So I don't know if you have want to go into that much further.
Right. So retribution on a collective scale is what revenge is on a personal scale. Really.
Exactly.
You know, someone has done you wrong, and you want to get them back for it. This is a natural psychological tendency. And so, really, if anything good is to be said about retribution in a justice system, it is to satisfy the will of the victim to exact revenge on their offender.
Right, and I would say not just the victim, but the sympathizers of the victim as well. Okay, so those are the 5 doctrines of justice that we're going to cite and then move forward in our discussion today. Just to launch right into it, up front, I'm going to go ahead and assert a few things. My primary assertion is that restitution should be the only doctrine of justice.
Restitution.
That's what I said.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Making sure.
Yeah, retribution, restitution, I don't want to get those mixed up. No, not retribution, restitution.
Right, so setting things right after they've been screwed up.
Yes. And the reason I believe that is because restitution, I feel, is, and that's the way most people understand justice anyway. And when it comes to especially criminal justice, there are other factors that I fold in with this. Restitution should either be the only, is my softer position, is it should be the primary doctrine of justice. We shouldn't be balancing the doctrines in some way. Restitution is the primary doctrine by which a criminal justice system and a society should function. And I believe this from a first principles standpoint on the ideas of property and ownership. And that's where I'm going to start from. I don't know if you'd like to tell me where you're going to start from, or you would like to go ahead and start asking me questions to evolve my point.
I think I can get on board with the idea that restitution should be the primary purpose of a justice system. That really what we're doing is we're addressing problems that arise when there are offenders and victims. That someone has wronged somebody else, and so we need to undo the wrong to the best of our ability.
Yes. And I'm going to go ahead and begin addressing a couple of common things I hear when I say that. And I don't usually say it exactly that way, but I also don't usually have 25 minutes to set up my point. The common several things that I hear, first of which is Well, when you start talking about restitution, those with material advantage are no longer affected by a justice system, like one that focuses on restitution. The more anecdotal example is a wealthy person drives their car into someone else's home and just mows it down. The wealthy person, the amount of money it would take out of the wealthy person's overall wealth to rebuild that person's house exactly like it was and restore all of the things that were in there that were destroyed is minuscule compared to the individual who had their house destroyed. And that's unfair because the perceived damage caused to the victim is not the same as the perceived damage caused to the assailant.
Right, and this in the extreme example is even true, even if you account for trying to compensate the victim for the stress that they were put into because of the incident.
Right.
Even if it didn't merely stop at rebuilding the house, but also, paying them off a little bit for what they had to go through.
Right, or if you had to make it all official, paying to put them through therapy for a year to help them cope with that fact that happened. Still nothing. The reason I don't... The real thing I think trying to be compared here, and I kind of spilled the beans on it a little bit, there is a objective monetary value for almost, well, for anything physical, I'll say. And some people will say, well, you can't put a price on happiness. And I'm like, well, happiness ain't physical. If you can bottle happiness up, I can put a price on it, okay? The other example I get a lot is a human life. Well, you're technically right. A human life is priceless until it's sold. And while I don't condone slavery by any means, the fact of from the point of view of the market, anything that is bought or sold has a price.
We don't even have to go there. We have a civil court system in which people can get sued for wrongful death of a family member.
Right.
And so in there, we very literally do put a price on a human life.
Sure, it happens all the time already, but I'm kind of talking about in the metaphysical sense, you can't put a price on life. It's like, well, we do it all the time, A, and B, what do you mean by price? You might not be able to put a price on it, but I can.
I guess that's sort of what I was saying is that the thing about markets and capitalism is that you can put a price on things that most people would assert don't have a monetary value.
Right. However, when it comes time to start dealing with a primarily restitutional justice system, that becomes something that has to be dealt with regularly. And I'm not saying I know the exact conversion rate between tiers and bricks. I don't know what that is, and I don't think it should be up to me to decide. But that's a relatively easier question, I think, to answer than questions of how much, looking at the other doctrinal systems, when it comes to questions that are raised in deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, retribution, I feel like the question of, well, this hard question for restitution on, well, how do you equate physical items to something immaterial like stress, which is material, by the way, but hard to measure. And I say that's an easier problem to deal with because we already do it already. We just need to get better at it, and that can solve the problem. But that's one type of value, to pop back to where we were. The actual objective market value of something. And then there's the perceived value of something. A good example of this people often will use is it has sentimental value. A 1956 Rolex watch of like the most mainstream design might cost $2,000 on the market today if I had one from that time that was kept in mint condition. The same watch that belonged to my great whatever grandfather might be worth more to me. No one else should be expected to pay that price because it belonged to my grandfather. But because of the relation I have with him and what that means to me, I can ascribe more value to it sentimentally, even if that will never become actualized in the market. My problem, and likewise, when you start talking about, well, what about a person's sentimental value for a house, and the fact that that house made up, exactly 1/2 of all of their assets. So the rich person who destroyed it should have to give up 1/2 of that rich person's assets. Now we're moving from a scale of, well, what's the market values to what is the individual respective value in percentage of something. And I don't like this at all, because this gets immediately super subjective, and I would argue that it's insanely hard to quantify, nor is it practical to put into effect. And I don't see any downsides from that, not implementing it in a restitution style justice system. And I can only use anecdotal evidence for myself. If I were the person who was less fortunate and my house was damaged because of a negligence on the behalf of a person far wealthier than myself, I would expect my house to be repaired just as equally of the person who may be less fortunate than myself, who was negligent and caused the same damage. I think, if you apply that same system that I said that doesn't make much sense backwards, well, what happens if you're assailed by a person much less fortunate than you? They cost you 1/5 of your assets. Well, then you get 1/5 of theirs. Well, that's not the same as the 1/5 that you had. Do you feel like justice has been done for you? No. Justice, when it comes from the perspective of the victim in the case of restitution, is all about restoring what the victim has lost. It should not matter who the assailant is. The concept of blind justice. It doesn't matter who the assailant is, what they have. It's all about looking from the perspective of the victim in the case of a guilty verdict. What did they lose? That is what must be restored. And once it is restored, it's fair or just.
Right.
And that's why I come from that perspective. Now, I will admit that I do tend to prefer, from the practical sense of the justice system that exists today, rehabilitation as well. That is my secondary. However, the cost of rehabilitation should be done under the scope of restitution as well. For example, if you, the individual who committed the crime, did so because you have a violent streak in you, you have anger issues, therefore you assaulted me and destroyed some of my property out of that, right? Well, not only should we cause you to have to repay all of the damages, and including my hospital bills and everything like that, but you also need to be rehabilitated for your own good. And that should be, I think, at the individual who's being rehabilitated's discretion. If you're a violent offender and you do not want to be rehabilitated, I don't think you can make them be rehabilitated. I think in the light of that, you should be offered in kind with incapacitation. If you can, and my whole goal behind this is productive members of society can settle restitution. Those who cannot and have not cannot settle a restitution. And no one likes to talk about this, but you get the exact opposite problem of the wealthy running amok because they have they have so much to lose, they can afford to lose a little and keep behaving the way they want. Well, the exact opposite problem would also exist depending on the victim status of, well, what if you literally have nothing to lose? You are homeless and own nothing. In the restitution style of system, what kind of punishment can be laid to you? And I feel the best things that can be done if restitution is the primary driver of a criminal justice system, you have two choices. You either incapacitate the individual, and by doing so, you have to in some way force them to generate the restitution, which I think is terrible, but these are all things that have to be chosen. But the other choice is rehabilitation, where not only do we offer the person who wants to be rehabilitated a chance to move up for themselves and benefit themselves, but they also, through the rehabilitation process, would become able to better settle the restitution for their original crime. And essentially, whenever you break the law and you commit a criminal act and are found guilty, I'm all for liberty, but once you have proven that you cannot respect the liberty of others, I think it's only fair that your liberty be restricted. So long as it's, there's always going to be errors, but so long as we are beyond a reasonable doubt sure, I don't think, we already do this, people in prison aren't free. They have no rights, really, Some of them can't even speak when they want to, in certain prisons. They can restrict any right from you that you have. What I'm offering is a way to let people maintain as much of their rights and dignity as possible, while also keeping things balanced and fair in what I see as the true point of the justice system. And I feel like I've ranted on for about 10 minutes, David, if you want to chime in here.
So, here's an interesting, slightly related question.
Sure.
So, I've had discussions about this for a while. This seems to be an intuitive conclusion that people have, but I think it needs to be discussed why we don't do this. The idea that, let's take, for example, people who commit a felony offense, okay? And they serve their full prison sentence. It's not a life sentence. They serve their 10 years or whatever they did something really bad. But now they're free, but they're not free because they're a convicted felon, and so there are still rights withheld from them. For instance, in the United States, we withhold the right to purchase a firearm, for certain white-collar crimes, we might even restrict your ability to have a bank account or something like that.
Or in some states of the union, we can restrict your ability to vote.
Right.
In the case of Florida.
So the idea that I've heard is, well, they've paid their debt to society, so shouldn't they be restored to full citizenship?
Are you asking me?
I'm proposing the question.
Okay. Both under the principled sense and in my proposed system sense, yes. I don't think there needs to be any record really kept that's available to anybody once a matter has been settled. For example, if you wronged me and you fulfill your part of the deal and restitution, and everything is brought back to fairness, part of that is also bringing the individual who committed the crime back to the status of being a law-abiding citizen after the fact, once the restitution has been slated. And I would even go so far to say that the matter is restricted between the two people who the victim and the assailant. I don't see any reason why any employer should even be able to ask anyone else and know for all certainty. It's private. It's a private matter at that point, because it really is. And I feel like that's one shortcoming of our current criminal justice system, is that it's a public matter. Every crime a single person commits against another individual is publicized to no end. And it's amazing to me how we look to other people who weren't even involved to weigh in on the matter. It's none of their business. It doesn't matter what you think about what happened. It's between these two people. And then maybe, just maybe, the third party individual or individuals who are decided to arbitrate between these two people or two entities, whatever. As far as I'm concerned, nothing can be gained from outside forces acting on this engagement. And I would even go so far as to say that, for instance, I commit a crime against you, I have violated your freedoms and your liberties. Well, to keep more of your liberties from being violated, I don't think that other people should be able to come in to your private matter unobstructed, and like the press are allowed to do these days, and riddle you with questions and track your every movements, violate your privacy, for example. I strongly not only feel for the victims of crimes, but also even those close to the assailant. They are oftentimes, in high-profile instances, tailed by constant media outlets and sources who are trying to provide more information on the matter. Whereas, what does that really do for society, besides ratchet up tensions? And don't get me wrong, I do feel like in the current system, this acts as a form of deterrence. When you highly publicize what's going on in the criminal justice system, you can show how much of a mess it is, and you can really broadcast how the flag that you don't want to be a part of this, and that's deterrence. But in a society where I believe everybody should know the law, that's one prerequisite I hadn't mentioned. The law should be easy enough to understand that the average individual should be able, and not only be able, but be taught their rights from childhood and the laws of the land, and they shouldn't be any more complicated than that. So once everyone has a legalistic understanding of the law and could essentially defend themselves in court, unlike you can do today, you don't really need deterrence.
Maybe we should possibly do another episode on an ideal legal system.
Possibly. I think that might be a good follow-up to this. Maybe not right after, but maybe right after. I don't know. It would be interesting. But back to address your question, no. If you have settled your debt, like actually settled your debt, yeah, you should be restored to full citizenship with all rights, no blemishes, and let it go from there. And I don't think and I think that one thing we should encourage in society is the fact that a person has restored the debt they impeded on somebody falsely should be looked upon positively. We should regret the fact that an infraction in someone else's freedom occurred. But we should also hold regard for the person who did that and then settled it. Like, I would like, and I know this can't always be the case, but I want it to be viewed on as a respectable thing to have pay your debt. And one reason I don't think that really sits well with people today is because what paying your debt means now is incapacitation. You can, we do see certain examples of restitution being occurred, but they're not the point. They're not. That's not really the extent of your crime most of the time, or the extent of your punishment. It's incapacitation and retribution. And I feel like that's why when a person gets out, because how do you even quantify that? 10 years of a person's life for some other monetary value. What does that even mean? It doesn't translate well for people.
Right. Well, and another thing you were saying about media coverage and deterrence is that, the reason why that is a deterrent is because there's a shame factor to it. And so, we publicize it. Look at the shame we should put on this person. And then it sticks with them for the rest of their life.
Right. And while, don't get me wrong, I feel like shame is a useful social tool in a temporary and appropriate contextual sense. All the other caveats I threw in there. But seriously, it is useful. But not...
Well, okay, let's consider the example of, say, a thief. Okay, a thief is to be shamed, so we catch someone stealing and we shame them for it. Then should they, should they repay it and make good with the person they stole from? Then their respect for them should be restored because they've redeemed themselves as an honest person.
Right, and don't get me wrong, we see this happen all the time in literature and stories, and I'm not talking about like the Robin Hood events. That's all messed up from the get-go because he's stealing from the bad guy, which is irrelevant. But what I'm talking about is there are stories about men or women who started out a life of crime, and because of hardships or whatever, that's not the point. The point is they started out in a life of crime and they turned their life around. That's what they always say. I turned my life around. And a big part of that is them repaying their debt to society and to the individual, more importantly, whom they harmed or committed a crime against. And we like stories like that. People like the redemption message and the optics of redemption, and in every level of society. You know, the people who need to be redeemed and the people who redeem themselves. And that's the thing. Redemption has to be something that is carried out by the individual who committed the crime. You know, another caveat to the restitution style system is debts cannot be paid on your behalf. You know, you can't have, and because that's immediately violates the whole point. You know, restitution is about you, the individual, correcting the wrongs that you inferred on another person, not someone else stepping in and paying it for you. Now, this doesn't include, for instance, the arrangements I talked about earlier with rehabilitation. You know, if I think there'd be a good reasonable model for a business in that endeavor where they approach people who cannot afford to pay the restitution, for example. And what they do is offer them a way to do that now, and then by being in debt to this institution, the institution is then incentivized, because they're out money, to turn this person into a productive person, to then pay not only the debt they incurred, but a little bit more for having helped them get back on their feet. It's a symbiotic relationship. By these willing entities to transfer the debt onto themselves, they tie themselves to the fate of the individuals for whom they covered. And now, the individual who originally caused the crime still has to pay it back. You know, they are still out of pocket. It's not like the debt is immediately forgiven. It still has to be paid. But someone can intercede on your behalf to settle it in the short term. And I would much rather see that be third-party individuals or entities that are not the same body that provides justice either. I don't like the concept of creating government employees out of felons, and chaining them to that system. I think there should be options available, but that's getting into more of the nuances of the talk. But yes, if you settle your debt, it should restore you back to where you were before. And if in anything, if you could show that you learned from the event, that's what will actually put you even further ahead. You lost respect for what you had done, and through shame. That's how you lose the respect, is through the method of shame. It's regained through the justice being done, which is your restitution. And then even further than that, you can use that experience to your advantage later, and even potentially come out better off than if you had never committed the crime. But I don't like saying that, because if in reality you've wasted time, the short lives that we live relatively to the cosmos. So
okay, I wanted to clear up that question, because that's something that a lot of people see is wrong with our current system. So
right, and I agree. I think that it's absolutely terrible what happens to felons, and especially when you look at how many people go to prison young. It's very unfortunate. I think that the concept of a criminal justice system for children is weird. I don't know. That's an entirely different thing. What I'm talking about primarily is for adults. While I do think that addressing problems that could lead to this type of system needing to be used on somebody should be addressed if any signals are given in childhood first. Prevention is always the preferred strategy. However, I also have enough faith in people to believe that if given the appropriate tools and being allowed to exist in a society that they understand the ramifications of what they do, if you make the consequences simple enough to spell out to anybody, in the legal society where, everybody knows the rules because they're simple enough that we can all understand it, then you don't have to teach them to prepare for that. They understand, and they can take it upon themselves to avoid breaching the law as much as possible, and even go out of their way to improve themselves to not do so. And I think that's how it should be. And I would even argue that it's really difficult to even make that choice for somebody. People, the lessons learned best are the ones you learn yourself, so. That's what I had to say about it. My biggest grievances, if you want to get into that, are primarily with deterrence and incapacitation. I don't. Retribution to me shouldn't even be considered or on the table. I feel like retribution is a flaw that we cater to too much, and is an unacceptable behavior. I don't know if it's so far ingrained in an emotional response that it could ever be removed, but I do think it's something that shouldn't be catered to by a societal system, because I can't think of a good consequence of retribution in the case of a criminal justice system other than to just make people calm down, which they would anyway.
Right. The thing with retribution is that it's something that we want to do in the heat of the moment. But when we are level-headed and we're trying to architect a system of justice, that should really not even be a consideration.
Right. And oftentimes I feel like retribution becomes perceived as necessary because of how long it generally takes, if ever, restitution is secured. If you, for instance, let's go back to my same example of the person who drives their car into your house and busts it up. Well, right now, how long is it going to take before someone else can help you afford to put that house back together if you didn't have insurance? Which, it's that person's fault. They should be paying to fix it. Well, right now, it might take years before that person even goes to court. And even further before they're even forced to pay any restitution. And in all that time, you're stuck with the mess that's been left over from the crime committed. And people brood on that. They see it every single day over and over and over again. And that's all they think about, to the point where they're just so cluttered up by what happened to them, they're not even moving past it, When you deal with the restitution quickly and people can get that sense of normalcy again, they can move past it. And I think the best example I can point out to this is when people discipline children. I'm not saying we should hold children to account for everything that they do because they don't understand. And we talked about that last week and the week before, kind of. But people often will show much more patience. And it's hard, but we can do it. If you can show patience to someone who doesn't deserve the punishment that you might really want to level at them, like, I don't believe there's a single person in the world that can tell me that a 4-year-old that's throwing a tantrum is no big deal and weighs on you in no emotional state whatsoever. I get beside myself, but I have to constrain myself because that's what I need to do, and I move past it. I think retribution can be something that's, if you can do that for something as annoying as a 4-year-old temper tantrum, which is like in the moment, if we looked at it as the 2 seconds of stress it's causing me versus a 2-second slice of the stress of something like someone running into my house would cause, I would say that they're actually pretty comparable in that slice of time. The difference is when a 4-year-old throws a temper tantrum, they tuck her out in 5 minutes. The difference is, and then when someone crashes into my house, it might be sitting that way for a year. If my house got rebuilt in a week, I could move on with my life. And people would. People do it all the time. We have an amazing ability to cope with things that happen to us, even if we think they're unfair. And not only that, but people are oftentimes removed from the justice process altogether because it's too complicated. I can't take that guy to court personally. I have to go hire a lawyer to do it for me. When then he has to hire a lawyer to fight for him. And all I can do is sit impotently in the courtroom, not even at the bench. I have to sit in the back with the rest of the people watching it. I have no personal investment in seeing the justice be done. I'm all proxy to it. So that's another thing. When I talk about restitution, it is between the two individuals, the victim and the aggressor, directly. You can hire people to come help you out with that, but you speak for yourself, and you're there, and it's you two working it out. And I feel like that confrontation, being able to work through that, will help people put the need for retribution behind them, because you get to be privy to all of it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's a more human psychology that needs to be addressed there that I'm not qualified to address, but that's how I feel about it. Is If I could take somebody to court myself and look them in the eyes and hear them say what they did was wrong, that's enough. I know that they understand what they did was wrong, and I know they're going to pay for it, and I can move on as soon as and not only that, but it's going to get taken care of quickly. I can move on, because I have to. I'm not going to let it eat my life up. I can't speak on behalf of others, though. I'd like to know what other people would think about that and talk through it with them, but that's what I feel about retribution. To quickly wrap up, though, for deterrence and incapacitation, I feel like deterrence is it's a social engineer's or a social scientist's dream or an idea on manipulation. It is. It's a manipulation on society. Because oftentimes deterrence is more about the optics of the thing than the practical reality. Otherwise, why are there such a thing as a mandatory minimum and a mandatory maximum for any given crime? Why isn't it just always up to discretion? And these mandatory minimums and maximums are so far apart that it's insane. And I understand that we're trying to create a justice system because we can't codify every single possible combination of events that could occur, and we can't even understand how heinous a crime could be or how heinous, I guess, a crime could be. Innocuous, yeah. Sorry, I'm going to make up the word if I don't know, but you get what I mean. But when it comes to deterring, it's you want to the optics are all that's important. Is you want to make like for instance capital punishment. You want to make sure people know that they can die if they do this. The reality, though, is okay for certain crimes that can warrant the death penalty. How many people actually get sentenced to death? And people aren't stupid. People figure that stuff out, and then you have to find another way to scare people. That the best approach to deterrence I've ever seen is the concept of the surveillance state, or the pseudo-surveillance state, which is where people keep themselves in line because they believe that they will always get caught. But that's not really a deterrence, because you're not leveling a punishment or a consequence of doing something wrong. You're just telling people they're always being watched, period, and they will always get caught.
It's not a deterrence, it's a threat.
Yes. Well, okay, name me a deterrent that's not a threat.
Okay, fair, but I guess it's a more direct threat. It's not, look what we did to this person who did this. It's, this is what we'll do to you, and we will do it to you.
Right. And I love when people tell me that all the time, and they're like, oh, that's not a threat, it's a promise. I'm like, again, what's the difference? But I don't like it. And there are always going to, in deterrence, I feel like what would deter one individual will not deter another individual, So you're trying to apply a standard universally, treating the whole as the whole, not as the individuals it's made up of. And so it's not effective. There's always going to be people that will say, well, to me, it's worth it to attempt anyway. And there will be those and deterrence doesn't even work for people in crimes of passion and heat of the moment. When people get the most angry or the most, emotional, which is the time at which a lot of crimes occur, they're not thinking about the consequences of their actions. You can't deter them when they're not in a rational state.
Right. You get home from you get home early from work, and you find your best friend sleeping with your wife of 10 years in your bedroom. You are not thinking rationally about what the punishment is. You're doing something.
Right. You're not thinking about, the mandatory minimum for first degree murder is like 25 years. No, the shotgun's out, it's go time, You'll deal with it after, because nothing else matters in that moment. You're addressing the issue right then, So, yeah, deterrence, it only works when it doesn't, which is always, in my opinion. It's a half measure. It's a waste of time. I can't take deterrence to its logical conclusion where, imagine a world where no crimes are actually prosecuted. They're all just deterred. That's, to me, is ludicrous. And I would be perfectly willing to discuss it with someone who believes deterrence is the best method for dealing with the best doctrine of justice. I would love to have that conversation, because you must be privy to information that I can't even conceive of at this time.
I'm now conceiving of a really weird future in which we say, this is what will happen if you commit these crimes. As you can see, 500 years ago, this happened.
Right. It just doesn't make any sense. Also, deterrence only works if there are people that commit the crime.
Well, I guess that's what I mean, is that the example, like, if that actually did work, then the examples start to become so far removed from reality to people that they're not going to see them as legit.
Yeah, you had to have a lamb to slaughter every so often or no one's going to take it seriously. And then the incapacitation. Well, I think that temporary incapacitation makes a lot of sense, like especially for fending off retribution. Let's just have everyone calm down and separate with a third party that keeps things under control. I think it's just awful to have a system where we dub somebody that has committed a crime bad enough that we lock them away for so long. At not only that, but at the victim's expense. If the victim's a taxpayer, how much sense does that make? It's a sinkhole. It's a sink for funds. And not only that, but there's no tangible benefit for the individual who is incarcerated. Which I know people are thinking, well, what kind of benefit do we want to afford them? Well, they're still people.
We want to make them a better person. That's what we want to do.
Well, that's the goal of rehabilitation. But I'm talking about, but even rehabilitation is a step to restitution. That's what you need. Plus, I would argue that incapacitation is either a far worse punishment than necessary or a far better punishment than necessary, depending on how long they're in there and who the person is. Time is one of those things that is respective only to each individual. I cannot tell you what my time is worth. You cannot tell me what your time is worth, and we all don't know how much time we have left. I could get hit by a bus tomorrow, and then every second of my life would have made up a larger percentage than a person that lived 10 years longer than me. You don't know. It's all relying on averages. And there's something perverse to me about the concept of saying, well, you stole $3,000 worth of things. Let's take away 10 profit-bearing years of your life, which is going to be worth way more than $3,000. And not only that, but all of the opportunities we can't even know that you've had. You're essentially holding someone's future hostage for a past event, when I think we should really be looking more towards the future looking more towards a positive future and settling the past, not just putting time between it. That's all I think incapacitation does to do, is put time between the event that occurred and the individual, the criminal in this case, and to separate people we collectively might deem dangerous from society, so that, well, they can't commit another crime again because they're in prison. It's like, yeah, but it's ticking time bomb on that,
And not to mention suppose you have someone who doesn't feel like their incarceration was a fair response to what they did. Now they have so many years in prison to think about how much they hate what has happened to them, because that's how they see it.
Right, and what's 10 years of my life versus 10 years of your life? Again, you can't know. And not only that, but it's leading more and more towards retribution, in a way, I think. People brood on that. There's no significant resolution. There's no moment where both parties are able to confront each other and settle the matter, officially. Instead, they're separated, and it goes stale and cold, and people only remember the negative aspects of everything that happened. And no positive outcome can be achieved or at least between the two individuals, and if they even wanted it, because there's just time put between them. I don't know. I feel like it's cruel. I think incapacitation, and it should be a last resort, and should be used as sparingly as the death sentence is today, honestly. And I think that you can incapacitate an individual in a different way than locking them in a concrete and metal cell. There are softer forms of incapacitation that are often used for like white-collar criminals, where they're restricted to a certain place or their home. What's the difference? If they're not in society? Like seriously, for society's sake, what's the difference between a house arrest and being put into prison? Societally speaking, there's not much, especially if the person on house arrest is ordered not to make contact with the outside, but they get to be in the comfort of their home.
Right. Yeah. At this point, it does depend on what the crime was. For a white collar offense, the offender's neighbors are probably not going to be concerned for their safety, having that person live. But if this is a serial murderer, they might be concerned.
Right.
That the difference for them between house arrest and prison is proximity.
Right. But I think this is all speaking towards what criminal justice systems are and how they don't really solve the problem and how they honestly overstep their role. In societies, criminal justice systems, like we had said at the beginning, are actually just tools trying to move society in a certain direction. They actually don't really... Every crime that's committed, every sentence that's handed out, is not done with respect to the individual who committed the crime. It's done with respect to what direction the society should go. And it doesn't actually concern the individual victims or the individual assailants, really. It addresses them individually, but the people that are really making the decisions at the top are really trying to guide society as a whole. It's a collective effort on a collective scale that I think should be brought to the individual level. Because each person is different. It's hard to assess each individual scale, and theoretically, the system is built to be able to do that. Every single person who accepts a plea bargain could have gone to a trial of their peers. Every single person has the right to sit in front of a jury and have a trial. Now, not to get too much into statistics, but that would be impossible. 95 plus of all charges leveled against a person and people who are arraigned, they all end up in plea deals. People say not guilty, and then the artificial justice solution that's really just done by the prosecuting attorney is handed out. A judge doesn't actually have to oversee a proceeding between two individuals. And I think that's largely emblematic of the problem. Some will say we have too many people committing crimes. Some people say we don't have enough judges or whatever. I think really the whole point of the matter is the criminal justice system is overstepping its boundary. Like, for instance, people will often talk about the protection. Like you'd said, incapacitation offers protection for those who might be the neighbors of a serial killer. Tell me, how does their protection factor into the goal of moving society where you want it to be? It doesn't.
Right.
It's there to make people feel good. And if you really want to get technical, protection is the job of the police, not the law, not the order side of the things. You can get the law and order example. How is it the judge's fault? And the prosecutors and the attorneys and all that. Judges don't protect anybody. Attorneys don't protect anybody. And I really don't think police protect anybody. It's all about you have to protect yourself until you can deal with the aftermath of what happened anyway. So, to kind of sum up my point, and again, I think we should talk about more of an ideal criminal justice system at some point, or a legal system. Sorry, that's what you had said. Because I feel like we could go from here and start talking a little bit more about legalism as a concept.
What we also didn't do, see, here we talked mostly about the motivations of a criminal justice system and not the implementations of a criminal justice system, which would also be interesting.
I agree.
To actually talk about the mechanics of it.
I think that would be very interesting. It's at this point in time I wish we knew a lawyer who could just come in and just tell us. But we are running a bit long, so I kind of want to wrap things up and just say that I really do feel like this was the start of a dialogue more than anything else. And I hope that we get a chance to expound on it farther, and those who listen can take their own ideas from it. I really like this episode. I feel like it's back to more of our original formula in a lot of ways, and we didn't so much explain as we just discussed. So if you want to know what I really think and sum up the criminal justice system, rewatch the entire hour, because I can't sum it up really anymore. It's just there's so many loose ends hanging out right now that I don't know really where we can go from here. But I think it'd be interesting.
This is not an easy topic. One does
No.
not sum this up.
No, you are totally right, and I think it's just goes to show this is just 1 hour of this discussion, and we are 20 plus hours likely into having this discussion with each other. And this has been essentially just the recap of everything we've talked about so far. Well, I think we've gotten to the point where we're talking too much about what we're talking about. So, I don't think I have anything else to say about it.
With that, Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.